Good morning. Good morning from Vancouver, and welcome to today's Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada's webinar. We're delighted to see so many of you joining us from across Canada and also Asia. To our Canadian audience, thank you for tuning in after what was a historic day of elections and a late night waiting for the results of those elections. My name is Vina Nadjibulla, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy here at the Foundation. For today's webinar, we are privileged to have as a guest Dr. Lynette Ong. Dr. Ong is a professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, as well as Political Science Department at the University of Toronto. She's a leading scholar on China and Southeast Asia. She's the author of 3 books, and her most recent book, Outsourcing Repression, Everyday State Power in Contemporary China, is of course the subject of today's webinar, but also is a book that has received quite a bit of acclaim and has already had a lot of influence on policymakers, both here in Canada, but also in the US and other democracies. She has based that book on years of research, ethnographic research in China. We'll speak a little bit about that as well, how that process went. And basically the book examines Chinese power and mobilization in day-to-day life, repression, both nonviolent and violent, of course, of repression, and sort of what understanding that about China could mean for how we make sense of foreign interference and China's actions also outside of China. That's obviously a topic of great interest to those of us here in Canada, but also other democracies. In terms of the structure of today's webinar, we have about an hour, so we'll start with Lynette's presentation on the findings of her book, as well as her research more recently, dealing both with zero COVID, as well as the changes that are now happening, obviously, with technology and state power in China. After that, we'll do a little bit of a Q&A that I'll lead, and then you'll have a chance, everyone who's participating, to ask questions as well. And we very much encourage you to type those into the Q&A function, and we'll get to them towards the second half of the hour. So with that just brief introduction, Lynette, I'll turn to you, and then we'll come back with some questions. Thanks so much. Over to you, Lynette.
Thank you so much, Vina. It's great to be here virtually with you guys, and thank you so much for hosting me. So in this brief 20 minutes talk, I will first give an abridged version of my book talk, Outsourcing Repression, summarize its main arguments, and then try to apply it to zero COVID. And at the end, I'll talk about how it is actually very relevant to how we understand the Chinese Communist Party's United Front strategy and how it conducts transnational repression beyond its borders. So the title of this book is about outsourcing repression. And the gist of my argument is that, the way in which the Chinese Communist Party conducts repression is very different from how we in the West conceives repression to be. So when we think about repression in a Western context, we think about, the government sending in the military, the police to make arrests, mass imprisonment, using kind of institutional and coercive forces to keep control, to repress and implement social control. But in the Chinese case, the book argues that the very success of CCP's repression strategy is the fact that it is actually outsourcing its repression to the society. So instead of using its own coercive forces, yes, it has police and a very small secret police. It has its own military, but everyday repression is hugely successful and is able to yield a lot of compliance in China, precisely because it's able to mobilize society, non-state actors, to do things on the state's behalf. And through that, the state is able to exercise everyday state power or statecraft as we understand it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the book asked a puzzle. The key puzzle is, when a government imposes repression, typically it wants to yield compliance. But at the same time, we know by Newton's law that it will actually create backlash. If you try to push something down, it will bounce back. It will try to bounce back. So the puzzle for any state who is trying to impose repression is how do you actually balance compliance? How do you try to coerce compliance while minimizing backlash, right? How to get the balance right. And I think the book argues that, in my mind, the Chinese Communist Party has really managed to get the fine balance between coercion and backlash. Next slide, please. So the book kind of draws on China's 20-year-long urbanization project to illustrate these process. China's urbanization rates has risen from 40% in the 90s to about 66% in 2002. And I think right last year it was about 69%. So more than kind of nearly 7 out of 10 people in China now resides in rural areas, compared to 30 years ago, it was only 4 out of 10 people. So China has gone through tremendous urbanization in the last 30 years. And when Li Keqiang, the former premier of China, when he first got into power in 2003, he actually made the announcement that China was going to promote urbanization explicitly as an engine of growth, right? So urbanization as a growth strategy for China. So you expect massive displacements. A lot of peasants have been displaced. A lot of people have lost their land, have also lost their house, have been relocated. Some people are being compensated okay, but a lot of them are actually not being compensated very well. There has been a lot of resistance, a lot of discordance. But overall, I think the Chinese state is still able to engineer massive urban transformation in a very short time frame with rather minimum resistance. Yes, there are some protests here and there, but there's no land movement or housing movement that we have seen in other countries, such as India, such as in Brazil. So that is kind of the empirical question that the book poses. Next question, next slide, please. So the solution that the book proposes, right, the answer is that the Chinese state has been able to pull it off because it has outsourced repression in order to augment everyday state power, right? It has outsourced repression mostly to 2 types of actors. One is violent thugs, violent gangsters, and the other types is non-violent brokers. And the nature of these 2 types of non-state actors are as portrayed on the book cover, right? So these are anonymous people. These are not people that you will find their names on the front page of newsreels. So these are kind of everyday folks in the street of China, right? For the violent thugs, kind of gangsters, ruffians, people who are out of a job, who are willing to kind of to sell their muscle power for a profit. And these are not kind of big mafia figures, right? These are just ruffians on the street. And for non-violent brokers are everyday community people who have deeply embedded within the communities, typically aunties and uncles in the 60s and 70s, retired officials who know the community very well. And when they go out to trying to convince their neighbors and community members to comply with state orders, they often do it drawing on their own social trust and social capital. And hence, on the receiving end, it doesn't even feel like this is state repression, which makes it all the more successful. Next slide, please. So, this book draws on various empirical strategy. I won't go into detail. I did ethnographic research for about 9 years from 2011 to 2019, conducted annually. I also have my team build an original event data set of land grab and demolition cases from the 90s to the late 2000s. I was able to see kind of through time the evolution of the strategies from more violent approach to non-violent repression strategies. My team also downloaded, scraped a bunch of government documents. So this is government documents from various municipalities, which I have spent a lot of time, particularly in Shanghai, Chengdu, and Zhengzhou, and trying to understand how these municipal government, how they instruct local officials, demolition officers, how they should conduct demolition strategies. Most of them would actually advise people over time to not use violent approach, but use more carrots to induce desirable behavior, but more importantly, use persuasion, trying to get people to convince neighbors and convince their relatives, convince their friends to give up their land, to give up their properties. So it's a very non-violent strategies that has been evolved over time. Next slide, please. So these are the places that I have visited. The table shows I started from Hefei, which is the provincial capital of Anhui province in the middle, right next to Shanghai. And over the years, I've gone to Beijing, Kunming, which is in southwestern China, in Chengdu, which I've one of my favorite cities in China. I've revisited it many times. I've done quite a bit of work in the outskirts of Chengdu, which used to be very violent, but they've also cleaned up their act over time. In Zhengzhou, which is very violent, has always had a lot of governance issue. Shanghai. So in the later years, I moved from kind of Western and Middle China to Eastern China, spending more time in Shanghai and Guangzhou. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the gist of the argument in a nutshell, right? So outsourcing repression is essentially a two-step process. First, the state go out there to marshal a small group of society to become proxies for the state who could do things on the state behalf, who could do things who could do the state's bidding, right? Then the proxies would go out there to repress or to mobilize the masses, and they go out there and control and trying to persuade the society. So the scope conditions, the conditions which makes outsourcing repression possible, is complicity of proxies. These proxies are in a way complicit to what the state does, right? And these proxies are non-state actors. They are social actors who are present in the society, has no state affiliation. And with that, the state is able to exercise everyday state power. Next slide, please. So what are the scope conditions? We can break down complicity of proxies to two parts. And I want to spend a bit of time on this because I think it will also help us to think about how United Front strategy works. So proxies can participate wittingly, right? If they participate wittingly, it is because the state has strength over the proxies. So this is like principal agent. The state would make an order to the proxies about how they should conduct repression. So you think about it as kind of state control over the military, over the police, over the thugs which they pay for, right? But the proxies can also do things unwittingly, meaning that they genuinely believe, they hold a normative belief that they are contributing to the public good by doing the state's bidding. So often kind of urbanization project is framed as one for the betterment of the community, to improve people's livelihood. So anyone who refuses to comply for their own selfish reason is actually holding up the welfare of the entire community. And because it is framed that way, people who are loyal to the Chinese Communist Party often believe that they are doing the community a favor, they are doing the country a favor by persuading those who refuse to comply to give up their property, to give up their land, right? And this arises out of ideological convictions, cultural myth, trust in government, which has typically been very high, like close to 90%, 80% in China, as well as information control, right? This is what Margaret Levy calls kind of value-based political legitimacy. Next slide, please. So, very quickly, the book, half of the book is about how the state mobilizes thugs, gangsters. And again, these are not mafias. These are not mafias that you actually find their name on the front page. These are ruffians, hooligans, hoodlums, street gangsters, or sometimes legalized professionals such as security guards who render violence for a for-profit service. They are often unemployed or people who just go out there to make trouble for a living. They could be hired on a day-to-day basis or could be hired on a project basis. On a day-to-day basis, the going rate was about 100 yuan a day, right? Next slide. But I think what is more relevant to the understanding of how of the Chinese Communist Party United Front strategies are what I call brokers. So kind of conceptually, I divide them into three types of brokers. One is political brokers whose power comes from state authority. And in the sense of local governance, you can think about them as urban communities, neighborhood committees, rural village committees. So these are 社区街道委员会 and 村委会, right? But these are also social brokers whose power comes from social capital they command, independent of the state, which is kind of the focus of the second half of the book. So these are community volunteers. These are enthusiasts. So, typical people are kind of aunties that you see on the picture here. They usually wear red armband, who go patrol the streets, and who would volunteer their time because they are retired. Otherwise, they'll be doing nothing. And by volunteering their time, they actually acquire some sort of status in the community. And these people are deeply embedded in the communities. They have lived there for like decades, and people know them, people trust them. When they open their mouth and say something, people will usually listen to them, right? I also have a section talking about economic brokers, who are essentially kind of profit-making intermediaries, whose power comes from capacity to reduce information asymmetry, matching supply and demand. And I analogize it to kind of ticket scalpers in Western context. I'm happy to talk about it more. But the focus here is really on the volunteers and enthusiasts whose power are independent from the state. Next slide, please. So the way to think about them is, if you think about kind of the Chinese state as a very powerful octopus, right? The Chinese Communist Party, we often talk about how powerful and all-encompassing its power is. But what makes it powerful? It's not really because of its bureaucracy. It's not really because of its coercive force, but because of its tentacles that is able kind of to deeply penetrate society and then grip society. So what are the tentacles? The tentacles are really the political brokers in rural and urban areas, and as well as the social brokers, countless number of them who will pledge loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party out of ideological belief, right? With very minimum compensation. There is some compensation, but very minimum monetary compensation. And with these people, the state is able to influence social behavior, and often in a non-violent way and in a non-coercive way as perceived by society, which makes it very, very successful. So it's a brokered state-society relation, brokered by social volunteers and enthusiasts. Next slide, please. So if we think about kind of the functions of the brokers, and again, I want to go through this slide because it is actually relevant to how we think about United Front. What functions do these brokers, these aunties and uncles play? They go out there and collect intimate and personal information about the household they are going to convince. So this information, you cannot send in the police or any sort of government official to go in there. Because if it's a government official, the household, the society wouldn't trust the official. They wouldn't want to divulge their family information, which is crucial in the way with which the government could then come up with a contract or an agreement, which would be agreed upon by the household. So knowing kind of the makeup of the households, the temperament, the relationship between the household members, very intimate personal information is actually crucial. And these volunteers help to acquire this sort of information. They're also a mobilizing vehicle for the state. They go out there and mobilize society, independent of the state. They also sometimes, in order to resolve conflicts, they'll go out there trying to manufacture conflicts. Manufacture conflicts, create kind of, schism between people, between families, between individuals, and then come in there trying to play to kind of mediate conflicts and resolve conflicts. They also occasionally they will also succeed in legitimizing state actions because they are non-state actors. When they conduct coercion, it looks like it is actually not state repression. Next slide. So this is, I think, the end of the slideshow. So I talked about the book, drawing on urbanization, at the end of it, so I wrote the book in the first year of zero COVID lockdown in China. And after the book was published, I got a couple of articles out in Journal of Democracy and in Foreign Affairs talking about how I see kind of the transformation of China's everyday repression. And I think zero COVID policies towards the end, using kind of violent approach and sudden reversal of zero COVID without any warning, which causes a spike in death rate and kind of breaking of trust between society and community people, community leaders, with the end of abrupt zero COVID policies, which Xi Jinping really wanted to hang on so tightly for so long, but at the end, it wasn't sustainable. There was a lot of white paper protests and protests throughout China. With that, I think China's repression strategies has actually shifted gear from one that has been so successful for many years. I think the model has ended. I think the trust between state and society has actually, come under a bit of a structural transformation in the last couple of years. And I think events in the past year in China provide a bit of evidence to what I have been alluding to. We have seen kind of increased violent events in China, even though the government trying to crack down. We see random violence. People go out there and just kill people. What we saw in Vancouver, the tragedy in Vancouver over the weekend. We saw that in China, half a dozen of those events in the past year. I think it's a sign of very pressured society, breaking of trust between state and society. So with that, I'll end the slideshow. I'm happy to talk about United Front and the wider implications for Canada-China relations.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynette. There's so much richness in what you just shared, but maybe picking up exactly where you left off about the fact that the last half a year of COVID and kind of the changes, the transformation that happened as a result of that, the white paper protests and all of that, maybe just kind of understanding why that's happening. So the model that you describe of this outsourcing of state repression to brokers, to trusted society members, seemed like a very successful model in some ways for a state to be able to get what it wants without experiencing backlash and resistance. Why do you think there is now a breakdown of that model? Also, to what extent that model was practiced in some parts of China, but not others, so like Xinjiang, Tibet, and others, right? So maybe if you could speak a little bit to kind of that difference between where CCP and the state was applying this kind of non-coercive outsourced version of repression, one that even to a Western sort of perspective doesn't even almost look like repression if you're not examining it at the level that you have, versus what we're seeing now with a bit more actual overt aggression, and then also the difference between the kind of the peripheries and the center.
Sure. Very, very good question. So I think the thrust, the premise of everyday repression is actually trust between the state and the brokers or the proxies, as well as between the proxies and the society, right? So in places where there is trust, a great deal of trust between state and society and proxies and the society, you could apply outsourcing repression, which is the bulk of China, right? With the exception of Xinjiang, Tibet, and ethnic minority regions, and Hong Kong post-2019. I would say in those places, it couldn't be implemented because there's no trust to begin with, right? Because it's an ethnic minority area where there's a lot of animosity. There's animosity to start with between the Chinese Communist Party and the ethnic minorities. So they couldn't impose this sort of model. What happened during the end of zero COVID was that when COVID mutated to become Omicron in Shanghai in April 2022, Xi Jinping was still very stubborn in trying to impose zero COVID when it was so obvious that it couldn't be controlled. They run out of people to mobilize. They run out of aunties and uncles to mobilize. They tried to mobilize university students. Some of my students were back home. trying to mobilize, run out of people because there are too many things to do. So they started hiring people from the street. Anyone, Zhangshan, some of them were gangsters because they were out of the job. And these people, in order to do what they were asked to do, started beating up people using coercion just to get that. So you go back to the first half of the urbanization strategy, which is the violent approach. Okay, you get coercion, but you also get resistance. And then you start to get protests because people did not have income for 2.5 years. They have to shut down their shops, their restaurants. You start to get protests of that kind, and then it evolved into white people protests when people started to demand the downfall of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And one thing lead to another. Xi Jinping decided that it's not sustainable anymore, but he did not prepare the nation for that. Reverse it overnight, and you have empty shelves in pharmacies, death rates, skyrocketed. Basically, every Chinese family, if you go ask them, they have at least one person in your either nuclear family or extended family who have died of COVID. There's a lot of social discontent. People don't want to talk about it. People want to forget about it, but I think it's deeply embedded in kind of social psyche. So I think trust is broken. Once trust is broken, outsourcing repression is, I think, no longer tenable, at least not to the extent that it was sustainable before.
And is that what you would say we're still in, that like now, a couple of years after sort of the end of COVID, is that trust still broken? And I guess the link to that is, it seems like so much of this depends on people, the kind of the true believers, if you will, people who are who want to do this, like the IEs that you mentioned, the aunties, older people. To what extent sort of there's commitment at the younger generation for this as well? So like what happens when those IEs kind of all age out of the process, if you will? So how is this model going to evolve now in the current era?
Sure. So, China has run out of volunteers, but the Chinese Communist Party has been cultivating a batch of volunteers, not only to serve in urban communities, but to go to rural areas, right? I mean, there's a corpus of kind of volunteers that the CCP has been cultivating. But you are right that, only older folks will really buy into CCP ideologies these days. Younger people, you really need to pay them. It needs to be a job in order to get them to do these sort of things. So you think about kind of the future sustainability of outsourcing repression. That's another question mark. But also coming back to your question earlier, and I think with the end of zero COVID policies, and I think how these things has evolved over time, and with Chinese Communist Party has also tried to export this very strategy overseas, internationally, with this United Front strategy. So if we look at kind of hometown associations, student associations, media, some of them are not even state media, civil society organizations in Toronto and in Western democracies and throughout Southeast Asia and other countries too. A lot of them are actually social actors and civil society organizations, right? And they do things for the Chinese Communist Party wittingly and unwittingly.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely an important point, and I want to go a little bit into that because in some ways your research in your book is an amazing contribution in understanding state power within China and sort of how CCP maintains legitimacy. But perhaps even more relevant to those of us here in Canada and policymakers here is how that's also now being translated into outsourcing repression to outside of China, right? In particular to democracies. So if you were to look at foreign interference or Chinese activities here in Canada, what's the balance between sort of the kind of the trusted community proxies versus the hired thugs versus, so to what extent all of this is translatable? Or if you could speak a little bit sort of what are you observing vis-a-vis United Front work efforts here in Canada in particular, and how that's similar or different, and what's the distribution of the kind of the trusted aunties versus hired thugs, intimidation versus actual persuasion?
So I think the motivation for doing things on the CCP's behalf or doing the CCP's bidding, there are a couple of motivation. in the United Front context, I think most of it is kind of financial and not so much value driven, because they have got organization or kind of incentives back in China. So if they do things for the Chinese Communist Party in Canada or in the United States, they might get benefit back in China. So it works as a stick, but it can also work as sorry, so it can work as a carrot, right? The CCP could give them carrots, but it could also work as a stick. So the CCP could give an order to an affiliated organization here. If they refuse to comply, they might face kind of tax implication or reprimand back in China. So it can be a carrot and stick situation, which makes it very, very difficult to comply. And as we know, kind of a lot of these people also have relatives back home in China, right? So if they refuse to comply, their relatives, their sons and daughters, their fathers, their brother-in-laws, sisters-in-laws, business or physical safety may get into trouble.
Right. But there's also social pressure, yeah.
There's also a lot of social pressure. But the way kind of to think about it is to think about community brokers in China too. So if you walk into a community, you see a lot of aunties and uncles. Some of them, yes, they are being mobilized by the state to do the state's bidding, but not all of them are. And I think that's also the way to think about United Front organizations. There are hundreds and thousands of United Front organizations in Canada, but not all of them are actually doing the state's bidding. We don't actually know until we go follow them one by one. There's no kind of organization by default that would doing the state's bidding. But because they are part of United Front, they are more likely to comply and less likely to resist the CCP's order.
Interesting. And doesn't that make it much harder, Lynette, to counter foreign interference, where sometimes it's hard to, especially so like if you have a diverse diaspora community, Canadian Chinese community is diverse, as you know very well, across the country. And we speak about foreign interference so much, but maybe if you could unpack some of the challenges, like what does this all mean then for the purposes of us being able to develop resilience here in Canada to withstand this kind of interference? But also not to then demonize the community, not to sort of conflict the variety of issues that you're describing, right? Like,
sure. It's a very fine balance, and I think it's a very tricky public policy question, because we could say 7 out of 10 of them are CCP's proxies, actively doing
CCP's bidding,
dirty work. But 30% of them might not be, and we don't know who the 30% are, right? So I think it requires a lot of kind of deep community knowledge, deep knowledge of that space, of civil society space. And how do we get access to this space in order to understand them? I think no one has actually done any kind of in-depth study of what this space consists of. We read kind of papers in the Globe and Mail, vaguely pointing to this space being all CCP's proxies, but actually a lot of them are not. So I think the risk of over politicizing these organizations is that you risk creating backlash. So you risk alienating the diaspora communities. So it's like repressing society. Once you repress them too hard, you lose their trust. It's difficult to get them to trust you when you want to get things done. But it's actually the compliance then that I think the Canadian government is most likely desirable of. You want their compliance, you want their trust. You do not want to alienate them. So I think the key is actually not to over-politicizing these organizations.
So then how would you go about, you're quite familiar, obviously, with the various policies that the Canadian government has been rolling out over the last 3 years, building a lot on what Australia had done previously and continues to do. This is not an issue unique to Canada, obviously. Are there things that you feel are working and that policymakers need to be prioritizing and doing more of in understanding and dealing with foreign interference from China and from CCP and United Front work?
I think there's a lot of scope for Canadian government as well as for Australian government. I think they have politicized this. There's a lot of scope for government to fund quiet, in-depth, serious study to study this civil society space. People with kind of access to Chinese space to understand what is going on within the community. There's actually a lot of dynamics going on, and we don't see them until there's kind of conflicts happened right in the public space, right? And we see kind of articles in the global mail, in the global news. But I suspect that internal dynamics within the diaspora communities could be actually very illuminating and could provide some clues as to what sort of policy assistance that the government can actually provide to them.
And
so
one
I would
thing that I
actually
should
if someone wants to fund me.
Great. No, that's well to note. And as I mentioned earlier, we very much welcome your questions, and I know we've received a few of them already, so I'll get to them in just one second. But there are a couple of more things that I wanted to tease out from what you've just mentioned, Lynette. And somebody's actually asking a basic question that I should have probably asked before going into the in-depth how to deal with foreign interferences. What CCP is trying to achieve by interfering in the Canadian process through the deployment of United Front work?
Yeah, so the gist of United Front, it originates when the CCP was fighting Taiwan, the Kuomintang, right? It was fighting the Kuomintang. So they want to unite all enemies of Kuomintang. So build allies as far as possible in order to defeat the enemies. So the United Front strategy, as its name implies, is really to build a front, a united front, mobilize whole of society, not only within China but diaspora, so that we can go fight the enemy. And United Front has also
the enemy being what?
Enemy being Western democratic government.
I see.
And it has also evolved. The strategy has also evolved to nab refuge, people who have the political refugees, the political fugitives, people who have been charged with corruption, escaped China, now reside in a suburb of Toronto. United Front has also been evolved to deal with these sort of people, to bring them back to China. That's kind of the premise. In terms of kind of actual strategies, common strategies is to create wedge politics. So like I mentioned earlier, create conflicts among communities so that you can divide the communities and then try to rule them through division.
And I guess another question.
Right,
yeah, another clarification question.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead. Another clarification question that's coming up is to what extent there's a difference between mobilizing diaspora community versus mobilizing non-diaspora proxies in Western democracies. So using...
I would say United Front is about mobilizing diaspora communities. Anything that is non-diaspora shouldn't come under United Front. It might come under CCP's other type of strategy, but not within United Front. It might like the consulate general or the embassy might reach out to certain organizations to try to get them to do things through diplomatic means. That wouldn't be part of United Front, right? That's Chinese diplomatic means, not part of United Front.
Interesting. And so I guess the question was from the audience was more around the difference in deployment of strategies for mobilizing diaspora versus mobilizing other proxies to do sort of CCP's work or bidding in democracies. Are the strategies similar in terms of kind of carrots and sticks, or are they different?
I think, there have been some media reporting of, the embassy trying to coerce people not to make a trip to Taiwan, not to do this and that, not to give this speech, not to talk about this and that. So there's kind of coercion, there's sticks involved. There's sometimes inducement too. If you come to me, I'll give you certain benefits. So carrots and stick involved through kind of more diplomatic means, as with a lot of governments try to do. But I think what is unique to China is this United Front strategies in addition to its diplomatic strategies.
Great. Terrific. Okay, we have a question here that says, in addition to observing the state's coercion and persuasion tactics, have you also observed members of Chinese society developing or altering tactics to resist, to sort of the resistance and in evolution of resistance to these tactics?
A lot. So I study protests. Protests, even though they're kind of far and in between and small scale in China, is extremely creative. Government come up with the coercion strategies. There are also kind of colorful and dynamic strategies that people, trying to put up with, and in order to resist. I would actually suggest that you go read my book, which will soon be free to download, and I'll let you guys know. I talk about economic brokers is actually a way of resisting the state without make it seem like a protest.
Right. I think that's fantastic in terms of it being available for free to download. Another question is more about, it says, do people, so kind of the idea that is it outsource if it's the state that's giving money to thugs or paying people, to what extent that's really outsourced is a question for an audience, right? So do people not see that that's ultimately the state or local government paying these people, either IEs or the thugs?
Sure. So if you think about kind of direct coercion, direct repression, we'll be sending in the police, sending in, like uniformed coercive force, right? Or sending in a government official to do the persuasion. But so even, thugs, gangsters, even though they are paid, they are not part of the state. They do not wear uniform. They are not part of state, agents. And hence they are outsourced. And you can hire them today and dismiss them in the evening when wash your hands off. And these people are no longer part of the government. They don't wear uniform. So they go out there and beat up people. And people who get beaten up might know that they are sent by the government. But there's no evidence. How do you charge them? So it helps kind of to evade responsibilities of the people, of the mastermind behind. And same with the IEs and the aunties too.
Is this a model that was used by other communist governments? I'm thinking specifically of the Soviet Union or even others in Asia, sort of in the 80s. To what extent this is unique to the CCP versus sort of a more general model of repression by totalitarian states?
Sure. So in chapter number 7, which is the one before last in my book, I talk about how this could be. I talk about this I use South Korea as a most similar case study. So, South Korea also uses a lot of thugs and gangsters, to clear land, to make space for the Asian Games in the 80s. It is also used, East Germany, former Eastern European countries has a lot of mass surveillance on the ground. People who keep watch on their neighbors, on their co-workers, and on behalf of the state. So I think this is by no means CCP strategies, but I think the combination of kind of violent and non-violent approach and the way that it has sustained over time, even in contemporary China, is uniquely Chinese, which makes it more successful. Whereas a lot of countries have used it in the past, not in the contemporary context.
Interesting. And speaking of contemporary context, to what extent these strategies are being changed or enhanced by the use of technology? I know you mentioned that one of your current projects is looking sort of at digital surveillance and sort of the use of technology for this kind of outsourced repression. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So we can think about how the Chinese state has been so successful in conducting censorship on the internet. A lot of this censorship is actually not done by CCP officials, right? How do you conduct censorship is actually a very high-tech, tech intensive type of approach. A lot of government officials do not have the knowledge, so they will actually bid, encourage private companies to come bid for contract, and in the contract which we scrape thousands of them from government website, we are able to see kind of specificities of what the government would ask for. You have to you have to give this requirement, you have to help us do this, help us do that. And they spell it out, and then they put the call of contract out there and invite people to bid. So there's actually an emergence of for-profit companies that tailor-made technology solutions, as well as helping government train people to conduct repression, to conduct censorship. So a great deal of Chinese government censorship is conducted by private companies paid for by government officers.
Private companies based in China, or to what extent are international companies also complicit now?
So these are Chinese companies doing things, largely in China, but there's also an international dimension. A lot of these Chinese companies has branched out to less developed countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, doing kind of installing CCTV surveillance camera and all those things, which actually help host government conduct surveillance. Right? But my book, the one which I'm finishing, is about how the CCP's various agencies outsource its censorship to domestic private companies.
Interesting. Do you think with sort of technology and surveillance being used more, there will be less need for this kind of the local community actors, or that the two will kind of coexist, both of these models of outsourcing repression?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we often hear about kind of grid management in China, where the communities is divided into kind of grid square.
Yeah.
So it's actually a combination of human talent, human capital, as well as technology. Yes, you have CCTV being installed everywhere. So with the help of technology, they are able to do a lot more. But this allocation of responsibilities is up to individuals, right? They have the help of technology these days, but if anything goes wrong, the responsibility falls on the individuals. And these individuals are sometimes volunteers. So, it's human plus technology. So if you think about it, the cost of repression in China is very successful, but the cost is also very, very high, which is often not talked about very often. Human cost as well as technology cost.
Absolutely. We have a question from one of our listeners saying, given that we're talking about the use of technology and technological platforms, they're asking, do we need to ban Chinese messaging apps or put them under surveillance in case they're being used to essentially carry out repressive activities here in Canada and in the West?
Yeah, I think it's a catch-22 situation. I mean, they are definitely a source of disinformation, and they have been active, in Canadian elections and elections elsewhere, feeding disinformation and trying to prop up pro-CCP candidates. We know that there's a lot of evidence pointing to that, but they are also essential tools, communication tools among the diaspora, especially with families back home. And once you ban them, because of the all-pervasiveness of WeChat, once you ban them, how do you expect them, how do you expect Chinese diaspora here to communicate with their relatives, right? People in China don't have access to a lot of WhatsApp and other apps that we have it here. So you take away WeChat, there's actually no alternatives. So catch-22 because of how widely used it is.
No, this is a tricky policy question, right? So then what do policymakers do? What are their options in terms of doing something that addresses the issue, but without kind of losing the trust of the diaspora community, as you said, right? So like without essentially creating a backlash here in Canada among those users who are using them. So then what are the choices for policymakers? You've been looking at this for a while.
Sure. So I would actually suggest, my suggestions would be have more kind of government-sponsored, impartial, informed community news channel that is in ethnic languages, Cantonese, ethnic Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and so on. So if you're familiar with SBS in Australia, they have got a very successful ethnic model. And I think we should think about it here in Canada. The reason why people go to WeChat is because a lot of these people don't understand English. And in order to read news, the only place is to go to WeChat. So if more of these ethnic news is available in ethnic languages which they can access easily, there's less of a need to go to WeChat, right? So we cannot control the supply. Supply is controlled by Chinese government and Chinese companies, but we can control the demand for knowledge, the demand and the availability of knowledge and information. So on that note, I'm very glad that, Pierre Poilievre is not elected and they are not going to get rid of CBC.
Well, and actually, I guess a more positive way of looking at it, Lynette, is also that the Mr. Carney's platform, Prime Minister Carney's platform that was released last week, actually speaks about this need to strengthen local languages of CBC and other broadcasters. So this idea that you're mentioning, right, that we can't essentially deal with this issue by banning things and in some ways almost adopting repressive tactics ourselves, but rather in creating an affirmative agenda of creating choices and alternatives and other sources of trusted news for these communities.
Precisely. I think that's actually really important in cultivating trust between the government, Canadian government, and the diaspora, right? If you have to deal with transnational repression, first we have to gain their trust. I think this is a way of gaining people's trust.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously, that's also a huge part of our foundation as well, as being sort of a trusted source of information. And these kinds of conversations, this webinar, in fact, and showcasing your extensive research is part of that. I mean, we have to understand to be able to develop appropriate policies and respond to the challenges that are emanating. One thing, I know we have a few minutes left in this hour, Lynette. I want to understand something that you mentioned earlier, that obviously this model of outsourcing repression is relatively successful, but nonetheless, there's a huge cost to society in China, both domestically, but also even internationally, right, in terms of reputational costs for China when it comes to interference and the deployment of United Front work. But to what extent do you think that's actually in any way challenging CCP's legitimacy or endurance in China? So, I mean, all regimes, I mean, if you look at Soviet Union and others, eventually they crumble because of the internal contradictions and because of essentially the breakdown of that society and state trust. What's your assessment, I guess, or prediction? I know it's really hard to make assessments of China right now. It's harder to do that research. You probably haven't done the kind of research you did even until 2019 now.
Sure.
How do you see the future of CCP, the regime legitimacy, if you were to make a prediction?
So this is actually one of my book projects, next book projects, right? So I'm really glad you asked. I would say trust in government, all sorts of measures, any sort of public opinion poll available until COVID, typically trust in central government is about 90-95%. Local government is usually about 75 to 85%. A bit lower. There's a bit of a gap between central and local government. After COVID, there's no public opinion poll. But all sorts of evidence suggests that after the abrupt end of zero COVID and spiking death rate and so on, trust has come down. We don't see public opinion poll because it's banned, it's not available, but we see evidence of people resigning from society. In Chinese discourse of Tangping, meaning that, I just keep a low profile. I don't do the 9-to-5 culture anymore. I escape to the countryside. People who are not willing to work that hard anymore. There's this sort of culture. We also see an exodus of talent out of China, middle class to Tokyo, to Toronto, to Vancouver. We see huge capital flight out of China in the last 2 years after COVID. We see a massive increase of illegal immigrants into the United States through Darien Gap and very dangerous route through Ecuador and then walk their way up. A lot of them, their fate is hanging in the air because of Trump. Basically, a lot of exit from the system. So aside from protests, there's a lot of exit in the system post-COVID. I think these are all evidence of people losing trust and declining legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. That is until 2 months ago, right? Until Trump 2.0, until the trade war, which I think is a gift to the CCP, right? Because, with this, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party can craft a narrative to boost the nationalism. Because now, again, we have a common enemy. We need to stay united and fight the enemy. So Xi Jinping has been talking up the importance of enduring pain through trade war, because we want to show that the Chinese people can endure pain. We want to fight the imperialist American power, So, this is basically a reversal of fate. We'll see how this trade war will evolve in the next couple of years.
That is absolutely fascinating, Lynette, because in some ways what you're describing is that in the last 3 or 4 years, there was this kind of silent protest almost by like resignation, lying flat sort of movement, right? And that is now changing because of President Trump and sort of both the kind of the waging of the trade war, which creates this kind of patriotic nationalist sort of narrative that CCP can deploy, but also perhaps, and I don't know if you would agree, by further diminishing the appeal of the democratic model in some ways, because I don't know to what extent there's sort of even those who may still kind of believe that there's a better model, democracies are a better model after the financial crisis and COVID and everything else. But do you see that also playing a role, that sort of not only is there a resignation on the part of the Chinese population with respect to influencing their own politics, but there's also this kind of feeling of kind of global fatigue and sort of nothing is working, right?
Sure. So at the beginning, zero COVID was very successful, partly because of the narrative of the superiority of the Chinese Communist Party model versus democracy. Like democracy, you could have tons of democracy. They're not able to protect people's lives.
Right.
And at the end of zero COVID is basically a failure, a slap in the face for the Chinese Communist Party, because your model is not able to protect people's lives. And hence there's declining trust and declining legitimacy. And then you have Trump 2.0, and you have democracies coming up with this sort of nonsense. And again, I think it opens up the scope and the space for the party to come in again and shape the narrative to the detriment of democracies. Again, talking up the superiority of the CCP model. What a gift. What a gift to the Chinese Communist Party. There's nothing more to say.
Absolutely. And another sort of self-inflicted wound and an own goal here for President Trump, but unfortunately also for democracies writ large. I am hesitant to end on a sad note, Lynette, but I do feel like we are coming towards the end of our hour, and I want to give you a chance to also maybe speak a little bit to some of your future work. You mentioned obviously that you are the current book, Outsourcing Repression, which really is a tremendous contribution to the field of understanding China, understanding CCP, how it governs, the governance model of the Chinese Communist Party, is now available digitally for free, public source. If you could speak a little bit to some of your other projects, especially as it relates to making sense of Canada-China relations. We mentioned obviously President Trump and the current moment we're in, but now we have a new government here in Canada. A key part of that is going to be agenda for the government will also be managing relations with China. It's been a difficult relationship for the last 5 years. What would be sort of your advice for how the government should approach Canada-China relations, both making sense of the opportunities that many understand about the economic opportunities, potentially diversification, but also the challenges of working with CCP and with thorny issues like foreign interference?
Yeah, I think, we need to think about, like I've mentioned before, kind of the civil society space of these United Front organizations a lot more in Canada as well as in other democracies. I don't think there's kind of substitute for in-depth knowledge of how this space works. I think because it's actually through this space that foreign interference as well as United Front transnational repression is conducted. If we don't understand it, we would only know things happened when conflicts have actually happened. So I'm doing work on foreign interference. We just completed a nationwide survey of Canada, of the diaspora and the population of Canada, a representative survey about 6 months ago to take pulse of Canadian society. I'm on the verge of doing this across other Commonwealth countries, such as in New Zealand. Also doing work on United Front. So this is part of my next book project too. Also doing work on outsourcing censorship in Chinese context, that book, should be available either end of this year or beginning of next year. So these are some of the things that I've been thinking about.
Fantastic. And I should mention to our audience that among her many activities, Lynette is also a senior fellow here with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, which we're very delighted to have her in that role. And that a lot of what she's referenced also can be found on our website, as well as obviously the Munk School's website as well. So we're coming to the end of this. I'd like to very much thank you, Lynette, for spending the hour with us and speaking about your work and your research and the book, Outsourcing Repression, and all of you who've tuned in. This webinar will also be available on our website, and you can check resources after that. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.